Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofrumento, and yet again, I'm not the only Bostonian in today's episode because I'm joined by a guest who is moving and shaking in an important industry that is truly going to change the world, and that is the electric vehicle industry. So many of you are well aware of my love for my Tesla and what all the possibilities are in that world, and today's guest is at the forefront of it, not only as a business owner, he's also a podcaster, he's a thought leader, he's got so much experience in that industry, and now he's leveraging all of that in his own business. So let me tell you a little bit about today's guest. His name is Chris Nihan. Chris began his career in the energy industry with SolarCity, the country's largest residential solar provider. After 2 years of solar and storage focus as a part of the Tesla acquisition, Chris was selected to be one of the initial 4 Tesla energy retail managers to lead the Northeast. After an eye-opening year at Tesla, Chris was hand-selected to join a small group within ChargePoint who are focused on owning and operating charging assets across the US. Through all of those experiences, which I'm excited to hear about, Chris gained so much knowledge and all that. He left ChargePoint on good terms to start his own consulting company called EVready Energy. Like I said, he's also started a podcast in this space. There's so much that we're going to learn from Chris, not only related to where that industry is going, but also for him as an entrepreneur. He's one of us, how he's navigating a really rapidly changing industry. So I'm not going to say anything else. Let's dive straight into my interview with Chris Nihan. All right, Chris, I am so excited that you're here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, it's cool to hear all the synergies that we have as EV owners, Bostonians. We'll have to find a place to disagree.
Heck yeah. Well, we didn't talk about it off air, but gosh, Joe, I hope that you bleed green because it's going to be a good year ahead for us.
Yeah, you know what? When I was a junior in high school, I spent my entire bank account to go to Game 6 of the finals against the Lakers. And I'm sad to tell you, I went to Game 7 against the Heat this year, and I feel like if they gave us any type of a chance, the crowd would have brought us to the finals, but it was just a tough night.
Yeah, which further evidence that we need Jason Tatum. That's what went wrong in Game 7. But Chris, so much that we could for sure talk about there. Give us the lowdown. What's the backstory? I teased a little bit about all your experience within this world, but how the heck did you fall into your entrepreneurial journey and doing all this awesome stuff that you're up to now?
Yeah. I got to admit, I sort of tripped and fell into this career out of college. I was doing accounting. My father owns an accounting firm, and I thought that's what I was supposed to do, but honestly wasn't very good at it. And so I ended up joining SolarCity and kind of starting at the ground floor in the Home Depot, and moved up pretty quickly there to a more of a management role within a region in the Northeast, and was lucky enough to join Tesla. And if you go into a Tesla showroom today and you see the panels on the wall with the battery and the solar and all of that, I was a part of a small team that was focused on rolling that out across initially the United States. Obviously, since I've left, that has transitioned more globally. So I did that for a little while, and then my close friend, who is still a very close friend, he ended up joining ChargePoint and kind of telling me about some of the exciting elements of EV charging. At this point, I already owned an electric vehicle for a couple of years. And so I kind of knew ChargePoint. I knew the great experience that they provided. And it seemed like this more complex world, EV charging, that was exciting to get into. You know, you're driving the car, so you're excited about the charging stations. As a Tesla owner, I know you know about that as well. You kind of get passionate about the whole industry. And yeah, my first 3 years at ChargePoint was primarily focused on a lot of the Appendix D funding from the Volkswagen mitigation settlement, helping states release that funding in an equitable way that would drive the electrification goals for different states. And then on the utility side, it was helping utilities come out with what are called utility make-ready programs across the United States, where they pay for a lot of the infrastructure to install charging stations. And then understanding the rate tariffs that the utilities create to charge commercial customers to help station owners understand what the best tariff is economically for them. What that sort of transitioned into was working with several of the larger enterprise accounts in the United States that were looking to build larger portfolio electrification strategies. And a point in time came when a few of the auto manufacturers started building their dealership electrification requirements, where they were forcing dealers to install charging stations in order to take allocation of vehicles to make sure that they could service their customers. And there seemed to be an opportunity to take some of those skill sets in the policy and the utility and with larger enterprise strategy to help dealers make the right decisions through these programs that were being created. And so within ChargePoint, we created a team of about a dozen people whose full-time job was helping dealerships, dealer groups create a strategy around their electrification investments tied to total cost of ownership, tied to driver experience, and then also work with the auto manufacturers to help roll out those programs successfully. So did that for about 2.5 years. Awesome journey. But I always wanted to scratch the itch of being an owner of a company. And there was such a gap in the industry around providing that strategy that it seemed like it was the right time to give it a shot. So trademarked this name EVready several years ago, back in 2017, and am using it now to start EVready and EVready Energy. So that's kind of my story, my background, and I'm grateful to share this platform with you to be able to talk about it.
Heck yeah. I love that overview for so many reasons, Chris. And I've actually never asked a guest this question, but I know that it's in the back of all of our minds when a lot of wantrepreneurs and entrepreneurs have similar stories to you, in that they worked at bigger companies or they are working at bigger companies. And you said it. It's what I really love about your overview is towards the end, you're just like, I wanted to scratch that itch. It's there. That's what I so often argue about the entrepreneurial energy is if you have it inside of you, it's impossible to ignore. You can push it off for a little bit. You can gain experience just like you did, but then ultimately it's all about stepping into that and serving the world at an even deeper level through your own company. But Chris, here's the question I want to ask you. I very often ask guests, well, what was it that made you say, you know what, there's room, there's an opportunity, there's an obligation from my end to start my own company? But for you, I want to tweak it a little bit because you worked at, I'd argue, two of the biggest players in the EV world, obviously Tesla and then ChargePoint. Anyone who has an electric car, we all know how big of a player ChargePoint is. And so with that in mind, Chris, not only did you say, I want to go out and I want to start my own company, but there's something about even having worked inside two of the biggest players that you said, hey, even though there are these industry leaders, they're not able to, or they're not focused on, or they're not currently serving this need in the marketplace. Talk to us about that vantage point that made you say, you know what, there's not only a gap, but it's a gap that I need to fill here. Talk to us about that transition.
Yeah. I think the way to think about it is this: the move to EVready wasn't about having a different strategy than Tesla or ChargePoint. It was really about enabling some of those larger brands that are doing such a great job in the industry right now. I think what happens right now in the industry is electrification is oversimplified. Everybody, I always make this joke to people when I talk to them, is that, but it's sort of a joke, but it's real. EV charging right now is the wild, wild west. You have so many different factors to take into consideration. You have the charging station, and how many chargers do you need on your property, and what's the use case, and how does the utility charge you for that electricity? And you're a Boston guy, one side of the Charles River might get charged differently than the other side of the Charles River. And how does that impact you as a station owner? Having certain stations at your property, how does that impact your reputation? How does it help you? How does it help you retain top talent at your company? Are you looking to make a return on investment selling electricity? Are you looking to sell a car? Do you want to get people to stay at your cafe longer? There's so many future proofing. There's, back in the day, you had 24 kilowatt chargers on the fast charging side, and I use air quotes when I say fast charging there. Then it was 50 kilowatt, and then Tesla came out with version 2 chargers where they're sharing power amongst two stations. And then modular stations came out. And, more recently, 3 months ago, North America just changed from the J1772 connector to the NACS connector being the industry standard, how does that impact your charging stations? And what's the battery management systems in your cars? And is there some type of a limitation with that battery management system to the station you're trying to purchase or that your customers are going to use? And what rate tariff are you on? So there's so many factors within the world of electrification. And generally, I think what I saw the gap is that a lot of times these are just looked as standard construction projects. It's looked at as a plug in the wall, almost as a gas pump. Existed previously, and it's treated more of a commoditized construction project. When yes, you do need that portion, but you really need someone that can explain the difference between how electric is tied to the world's cloud and a network, and it's also tied to the grid, whereas a gas car wasn't. And how does that impact you? What are the risks? What are the benefits? And so where sometimes EV charging is oversimplified, we want to bring all of these components that are critical to a customer, help them understand those components, make those decisions that put them in the best chance for their core business to succeed. And that's why our tagline is electrification simplified, because we want to take all those complex things and make it very simple for the end user so that they know that they have somebody who has their back with these incredible products that companies like ChargePoint is making.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I'm imagining what the listeners are going to be taking away from today's episode, because in my head, like, you're speaking our language, Chris, because you and I are EV owners. So everything that you're talking about, listeners might be like, well, this is highly technical. How much does this actually apply? But as an EV owner myself, I mean, the fact that Chris is dropping things like J1772, we all know what that is. Like, it had to come standard with my car. It's something that I'm aware of. When I roll into a charging station, I'm just like, do I have to use my adapter? Does it natively go into my car? These are questions that matter to all of us. So Chris, you speak the language, but the other thing that I'm really hearing, which is funny because I think that a lot of entrepreneurs underestimate the external influences in any industry. And here we are in your industry. We're talking about different plugging, like the different adapters that we need, the different interfaces. All of those things are very important. For other businesses, it might be like I owned an SEO agency when I still lived in Boston. We were at the mercy of every time Google made an update, our entire industry changed, our entire approach had changed. And that's why I learned very quickly back in the early 2010s, having that business, that being nimble, it's one of the most important traits of an entrepreneur. And Chris, Tesla can make an announcement. Heck, Elon could send a tweet out tomorrow that could change your entire industry. He could announce that the Tesla supercharging network is open to all manufacturers, which changes the game. Talk to us about how you stay on the edge of this and the importance of being nimble, because your industry, it's easy to have goals for the next 5 years, but it's so many different things are going to change between now and 5 years from now. How the heck do you navigate those waters?
Yeah, so in terms of being nimble, it's critical in this industry. It's the Wild West. Things are changing every day. You're always seeing different highlights, things that are happening that to your point, the NACS connector announcement completely changing the industry in so many different ways. And I think people are looking to learn more. But the thing that all of your entrepreneurs that are on this podcast share is that they're so passionate. And I didn't really care about gas cars. It wasn't something I wasn't a car guy initially, but someone let me test drive their Tesla in California back in 2015. They probably thought I was stealing their car, or trying to steal their car when I peeked my head in. But once they realized I was just curious, like any good Tesla owner back in the day, they let me test drive the thing. So I just became really passionate initially about Tesla. That's how it got started. And then very quickly, as I realized how connected it was to software, I always like to tell this fact is 90% of all Gen Z today have an iPhone, despite the fact that there are so many other solutions out there. And why is it? It's because of that ecosystem they're creating. And so creating a passion around software and how software is kind of changing the world was the next piece. And then the third piece was on the utility side, realizing that the grid is 100 years old and that there's going to have to be considerations for electrification to happen successfully. Became excited about that. And at this point, I'm reading articles every day. Whenever I have a second, I'll kind of look on Twitter and see what the big things are that are happening in the industry. And then obviously having come from Tesla and ChargePoint, having to drive strategy for some of those really large companies, a little bit of inside baseball into what's happening or what's going to happen. And that allowed me, I think, this is what I always like to tell people is sometimes I'll get the question of, hey, tell me about different elements of the charging industry. And the feedback I get is, well, tell me what you want to know about, because things are happening so quickly right now. I can probably tell you about some things, but other things I might have to research a little bit. But the important thing is asking the right questions for some to get to like some of those core principles that are needed. But in this industry specifically, if you're not nimble, it's really difficult in this industry. Things are just changing so quickly. On the DC side, power levels are going, 10x increase in power. New softwares are always coming out. Utilities are always changing, how they work with you. In most cases, they're trying to make it more equitable for customers, but they have to make certain decisions at certain times, and there's different funding that's always coming out. So, that's one thing I always tell customers is, whether you're focused on, you need the installation support, you need hardware, software support. You just need consulting because you already have somebody that's assisting with those things. You got to just figure out where to fit the value into where somebody is already. And so that's what we're trying to do all the time right now is we're not, telling customers, hey, you have to use us for everything. We'll be whatever somebody needs us to be. We just need to ask a few questions for them so that we can define that correctly.
Yeah. Chris, it's so interesting hearing you paint the landscape of your industry, because it's something that I guess I even took for granted, is that obviously it's sexy and it's fun to talk about the Teslas, the ChargePoints of the world, the ones that are driving new things in the industry. But hearing you say words like the grid, the utility companies, I'm just like, those are on opposite sides of the spectrum. Those are the old guys. Those are the archaic ways of doing things. But it's interesting thinking about your positioning in the marketplace is you really are at the intersection of this dichotomy of old and new. And so it leads me to ask the question of, I would imagine that there were times, and especially you and I still as young-ish entrepreneurs, there are times where we're just like, how are we going to break into this world of old big players when we're talking about the traditional power grids, when we're talking about, you and I talked off air about the ways that, buildings, commercial, residential buildings view their benefits, their perks for their leaseholders is they don't necessarily think about these things. Still, they don't have that adoption just yet. Not everybody speaks the language that you and I do. So with all of those considerations in mind and that dichotomous situation, what's your take on that? Is it scary? Is it exciting? Do people know what the heck you're talking about? Do they not know what you're talking about? How's it framed, the way that you even approach them and start those conversations? Gosh, I'd love to hear the way that you're in there.
I love that you asked that question. So I think when most people are approaching an EV charging project, again, they're really focused on it from their own lens. And this is the analogy I like to make is it's kind of like when people are coming to you talking about EV. It's like it's 2008 and Apple just released the first iPhone and they have a flip phone, which I like to equate to the gas car. And maybe they have a BlackBerry, so they still have their physical keyboard. That's your plug-in hybrid. And they're looking to go get a smartphone, which is a fully battery electric. And they're kind of asking you the wrong questions. One thing I always tell people, sometimes we train dealerships on how to sell electric cars. And my number one rule, I say, if you take anything away from this discussion, it's don't answer technical questions or gas questions with technical answers. Because when you ask somebody, hey, when they say, how long does it take to charge? And you say, well, 20 to 30 miles of range an hour for that charger that's sitting out there in the parking lot. People then equate that to their gas experience. But the reality is there's another application for that charger. It's a dual charger. As you know, you charge at home, you charge at work. And if you can explain to them why it's more convenient for them opposed to more inconvenient, it's when you change the narrative, it allows you to tell a story that makes EV exciting and makes it something that people want to purchase. But in general, I think, especially on the commercial side, commercial owner side, understandably, 97% of the population doesn't have an electric car. They haven't driven an electric car. It's more of a political topic than anything. And so there's certain reservations people have, or what people hear, that, there's a lot of misinformation that's floating out there. So what I try to do is not answer the question that people are initially coming to me asking for. I try and ask all the right questions around the requests that they have, to make sure that I'm actually solving their problem. I'm not just installing a station that they think they need that they don't, or they're getting the wrong use case, or the wrong application in the wrong part of the parking lot that costs them more money than they were expecting. I just try and make sure that that they understand what they're asking. And usually it ends up leading to 2 or 3 extra conversations, and usually a longer relationship, which is really what I'm always looking for, is to be that person that somebody can go to ask all those difficult questions, and know that someone's not just going to say, yeah, sure, I'll put that plug in your parking lot. I want to make sure that people understand what they're purchasing, why they're purchasing it, and how it's going to affect them or their customers.
Yeah, Chris, you're really taking me back. So all the way back in 2008, I was a freshman at good old Bentley University back in Waltham, Massachusetts. And that was when I started my first business, which was a soccer blog. And thinking back to those days, Chris, it was so interesting to me because I set out starting that blog to serve soccer fans. I was writing articles for them. I was building my website around the soccer fan experience. And it wasn't until, a year into this where I made my first $200 as an entrepreneur with my first advertising deal. And that's when I realized who my customer is not the soccer readers or the soccer fans. My customer are the advertisers. They're the ones who are actually paying me. They're the ones who are actually making this possible. And I think that's what's so interesting about the world of EVs, the world of your entire industry. I'm going to extrapolate it. It goes beyond just the electric vehicles. It's charging, it's the grid, it's power providers, it's the buildings, it's all of these things that you talked about. With that in mind, when you started your company, EVready Energy, who did you identify as your customer? Because there's so many different subsets of this that you could serve. And obviously consulting covers, your strategic insights from your past experience are both broad, they're wide, and they're deep. So how did you isolate, this is the type of customer that I want to serve, and how did you identify them?
Yeah, generally for me, the question has always been, whose core business is most affected by electrification? Where I'm least competitive for my company, not to say that I don't work with these customers, but where I'm least competitive is a standard commoditized installation of a level 2 charger in a parking lot, where it doesn't really affect their core business for whatever reason, and they're just looking for an installation quote. Maybe there's no funding available, but the circumstances aren't too large. That's kind of a more challenging relationship for me, a more commoditized one, where companies' businesses are affected by EV charging, and how they go about EV charging is where I can help most. So your most complex projects. I'm going to give you an example: a fleet depot for New York City yellow cabs in an area that is extremely condensed, so there's not a lot of parking available. The utility timeline takes several years. The tariffs that exist there are dynamic. There's a lot of different ways that you can be charged, depending on how you install the stations. Do you have battery storage that's being installed? At what time of the day are the cars charging? What's the aggregate power level of all of the stations being charged at a certain moment in time, and how does that impact your electric bill? What is the driver experience of the people that are coming into that location? Another type of customer is maybe they have some vehicles within their fleet where they have to be going 24/7. So the faster you charge, the better. But then they have other parts of their fleet where they're only used 3 hours a day or 6 hours a day, or maybe they have to be used a significant amount between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock. Well, how do you build that depot strategy? And with what types of stations? How do you make sure that those stations handle the battery management systems of the vehicles? Some cars, like a Tesla's a 400 volt battery. Other vehicles that are out there are an 800 volt battery. How does the charging station handle? Does it have liquid cooled cables? Is there funding in that region to go after? If there is funding, what are some of the things that you can do to maximize your funding that's available? If you're going to have to future-proof the site, and you're going to go from 30 cars to 300 cars in the next couple of years, how do you minimize your investment today, but future-proof so that you can get to where you need to get to in 5 years. And then within the automotive space, you think about car dealerships where they're servicing so many different vehicles, but what does the experience of the future look like at a car dealership? The traditional car dealership, you go in, you kind of buy the car and that's it. You don't really fuel there. But let's say you're a car dealership in Maine and it gets to be -20 in the wintertime. Well, if the car is getting delivered at 20% or 10%, what happens if it runs out of battery? Can you just plug the car in? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. So where should you put charging stations for new inventory? If you're looking to have the car delivered, what's the experience you want to provide the customer to make them feel confident that when they leave that they can charge? Is there public fast charging available within your region? Is that an opportunity? Are you looking to put in a cafe within your car dealership? Do you want to tie a software loyalty program where maybe there's something where, hey, we're going to charge you to charge just like a gas station, but everything that you spend at our public fast charger, if you sign up for our loyalty program, can be used as a credit towards a future vehicle purchase on our website. There's just so much strategy around these customers where it affects their core business. The automotive space is something that I specialize in. Large fleet electrification is a big one. And then my other focus is on DC fast charging in general, just because that's probably the one where customers are at risk of no matter what vertical they're in, of obsolescence. I always like to use the term obsolescence protection. These charging stations are, some of them are very well built. Some of them cut more corners. And for example, how many charging stations are out there that have non-replaceable cables after the NACS connector was just announced as the new universal standard? How many of those are going to have to be replaced? How many of the cables can just be ripped out and popped back in? What chargers can do that? What chargers can't? The whole industry just went through a phase where the 3G cellular network obviously just went out. And so many chargers had to be replaced because you couldn't just replace the modem. You had to replace the entire charging station. So there's just so many small dynamic nuances, but those challenges provide opportunity as well. And that's generally where I focus on customers whose actual core businesses are most affected by electrification in the most complex way. And they need to build a large nationwide portfolio strategy.
Yeah, Chris, I really like the way you articulate that, because you're right. You pick the word nuances, and gosh, I think that is such an appropriate word for there, because there are so many of these considerations. The other thing that really stands out to me is how many times in our interview here today, you said the word future proofing. And I really like that concept, because for us as entrepreneurs, heck, if someone listening to this, whether they're in the EV industry, they never plan on owning an EV, whatever their circumstances are, future proofing is something that we all need to think about. And you gave some examples that have already in real life impacted your industry. I think about, I don't know if you remember this, when Starbucks announced we have wireless chargers built into every table, and they picked that one platform for it, and it's totally obsolete now. I don't know if any devices ever went to market because Apple chose another way. And we see it, Apple changes their charging ports, for example, every other year. Finally, they're doing USB-C, and we're going to start seeing public USB ports are going to be shifting to USB-C. So there's all of these things, but future proofing is at the heart of it, which obviously speaks to your traits, your skills, your strengths as a consultant. Having so much industry experience is that this is the exact nature of the strategy. This is why you want someone on your team. But talk to us about future proofing, because it is so hard to look forward. Where does your brain go when it starts to think about, how do I future proof with so many unknowns, with things changing every single day? What's the key to future proofing, whether it's within the EV industry or within our businesses?
Yeah. Well, when you said it, the first thing that my mind went to was in this industry. I can kind of think beyond that, or try to, but within the charging industry, it's I think when people say future proofing, what they're initially talking about is the utility. And hey, when you're doing a project and you're trenching in the ground, why don't you put the additional conduit in the ground so that when you want to add more charging stations, you can do that? And I think that's a critical piece, but that's usually what people hear or think when when they say future proofing. I think the other piece that's unique too, and definitely another nuance, is generally the utility doesn't want to offer up more power when they're bringing in a new service if than what's being used at the time. So to have a nuanced discussion with the utility to try and bring in more power than, say you're a Ford dealer and you're about to put in 600 kilowatts of charging, but you're going to need 1,200 in 2 years. Well, how do you get the utility to bring in 1,200 right now? There's some nuanced ways to have those discussions. And then the other piece too. So what I always recommend is dealers are always looking to, and I work very closely in that automotive space, so I kind of go to dealers very quickly. They're looking to install at the lowest cost possible in the moment. But the reality is the way that you're charged on your electric rate, because the load profile for EV charging stations, it's very unique. Sometimes you'll be using 4 Walmart supercenters worth of power for 5 minutes, and then the stations won't be used for another 24 hours or something like that. And what happens is it thrusts the utilities rate tariff that you're being charged on as a commercial customer onto a more expensive rate than it needs to be for the existing electricity that you're already using. That applies to dealers, it applies to other customers too. And so you want to set up your situation or your circumstance so that those building loads are being isolated as to the way that the utility is charging them. So that's one way that you want to be future-proof too. All of this policy with utilities is going to be coming out across the US, and you want your location set up so you can very easily take advantage of some of those policy changes that are going to lower your operational costs. The way that future-proofing isn't really used in the industry too much, but I love to talk about it, is tied to, yes, hardware. And sometimes you'll get questions about level 2 charging, which I think Tesla properly defined it, which is destination charging. And then you have your fast charging stations. On the charging hardware side, I think fast chargers are more at risk of becoming obsolete. So you want to install some type of a charging platform, if you can, that has power conversion outside of the stations instead of within the stations. That way you can treat those chargers like Legos and grow up to speed, bring it down if you want to add more chargers to that same power. But power conversion is an important thing outside of the charging station. On the level 2 side, it's a destination charger, so it's never needs to become significantly faster. I think what's very underrated in the charging industry is protection from obsolescence around software. And again, 90% of Gen Z has an iPhone. Why? Because of their software and their ecosystem. And so I like to tell customers, if you're not focused on the software side, you should be, because you don't want to be on the outside looking in of the right software experience, because people will make purchasing decisions based on what software is being used. So that's kind of like on the charging side. I think as like a small business owner, it's tough. It's really tough. The world is moving so fast right now. I think like is best, and I'm trying to do this myself right now. I know a lot about charging, kind of can keep up with that. What I'm always trying to look out for is like what other ancillary businesses are happening to the left and right of me that EV charging could impact, or is it something else related to technology, or is it going to affect the customers that I'm working with? I'm trying to like learn on the side. I'm trying to keep up with some of these other industries and always make sure that we're on the cutting edge of what customers actually need. Right now they need electrification experts tied to someone who understands utility policy, charging, installation. At some point in time, that could shift to something else. And I always try and stay ahead of that to the best of my ability. But there's always more work to do there.
Yeah, I love that transparency, Chris, because I think we need more of these conversations in public, because you're not alone. Listeners, you all are not alone. Chris and I are constantly facing the same challenges that you are, which is how do we stay ahead of these things? Because you don't want to be the one caught. I guess the only thing I can think of now is caught with your pants down, that thing that phrase that we have here in English, because it is so important, is that you want to move with the industry or ahead of the industry, not too far ahead, but not too far lagging behind. It is really that Goldilocks approach. And the only way that you get there is by investing in your personal development, your business development, your knowledge, your skills, your expertise. Chris, for you, so much of your experience came from your professional career, but you continue to get better at honing your craft. So I think it's such an important message. And And I love the fact that you shouted out software, because I'm going to give a quick Tesla shout out, as if I don't do it enough already on this show. But my car has gotten better since the day that I bought it. Over the past 4 years, however long I've had my car, it continues to get better. That's the cool thing about this industry and so many others. We're seeing it in the world of AI with ChatGPT always rolling out new updates, is that if you're at the cutting edge of software, there's a whole world of possibilities and considerations there. So, gosh, Chris, we went into so many topics today. I always love posing this broad question to my guests at the end of our sessions, which is, what's your best advice? With so many things that not only we talked about today, but that you've learned in your own career as a small business owner now, as someone who's at the intersection of a really burgeoning industry right now. Chris, what's your takeaway for listeners? What's the one thing that you hope everybody says, you know what, this is what I'm going to focus on, because whatever happens around me, this moves me in the right direction towards my dreams, towards impacting people and making a difference. What's your best advice for listeners?
Yeah, be open to change and have no regrets. There's an episode in Game of Thrones with a quote that I always love, and it's where there's chaos, there's a ladder. And so, maybe you're a professional and you're looking to become an entrepreneur. That's why you'd be listening to this podcast, I would imagine. But where there's chaos, there's a ladder. And if something intimidates you or confuses you or makes you a little bit, scared or fearful of your future, maybe it's something to take a look into and learn more about, because I think once you get over that hump of fearing change or uncertainty or insecurity, and once you feel like, once you get past that, or if you don't get past that you'll be okay, there's just a whole new world of opportunity and ways to look at things and be creative. And yeah, if you're a creative person at a company and you think that that there's an opportunity for you to become an entrepreneur, just try and get over that initial fear. And I promise that it'll all be worth it.
Wow, Chris, gosh, I absolutely love where you took that question. As someone who never bought into the Game of Thrones hype and has never watched an episode myself, I love the fact that you dropped some knowledge on us, so I don't have to watch it because I refuse to cave into all the hype. But with all of that said, honestly, Chris, you've been such a wealth of knowledge. I love the fact that you are also a fellow podcaster now, continuing to put out so much of your thoughts on the industry there. You're interviewing industry experts. So I want to give you a shout out and really applaud you for that. I personally, of course, know how much work goes into hosting a show, lining up guests, all that good stuff. So huge kudos to you. I think you're really going to be such a key player in the industry moving forward. So with all of that said, where the heck should listeners go from here? How can they follow the work that you're doing, the work that you're doing with EVready Energy? Drop those links on us so listeners can check out your awesome work.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So I started the EVready podcast. It's so funny. So we connected on the fact that we're Celtics fans. So back when I was in college and you were doing a soccer podcast, I had a blog called Celtic Fan Chat, and that was the first Celtics podcast back in the day. So when I was going to start my company, I always wanted to kind of get back in the podcasting space. I always admired folks like you that had one and wanted to start one. The goal of my podcast is I've met so many high-level, high-quality, not just business people, but individuals over the past 6 years in the electrification space. And I wanted to create a podcast that could feature people that have critical knowledge and expertise beyond me in very specific subject matters or customers that can talk about industries that people would find interesting. And so that's the EVready podcast. It's available anywhere that you would be looking for one of your podcasts. And, just for example, we've had the director of automotive at ChargePoint. We've had a nationwide installer who's probably installed more stations than anybody else in the United States. Coming up soon, we'll have the New York City Yellow Cabs. We'll have head of investor relations for one of the largest utilities in the United States. We'll have a company on that talks about battery storage and how to think about that and the economics around it. And so the intention is if you're looking to hear from people that lead this industry, that's the podcast to find it. And then if you go to EVreadyenergy.com, that is the website where you can learn a little bit more about us. And if you have any questions, my email is cnihan@evreadyenergy.com, and would love to have a conversation with you.
Heck yes. I love what you're doing with your podcast. And I even more love it now knowing the backstory to it. It's crazy. Just these two young kids from Massachusetts starting sports podcasts back in the day. Who would have known full circle that this is what it leads to? I love that so much. Honestly, Chris, you are doing amazing work. I can't applaud you enough for it. I'm so excited to follow your work from here. So listeners, you all already know the drill. We're dropping those links that Chris mentioned down below in the show notes, wherever it is that you're tuning into today's episode. So check those out. We're also linking to Chris's personal LinkedIn. It's how we came across his work. We really loved reading his overview of what the industry looks like and painting that picture of the landscape. So if you want to connect with Chris, say thank you. Us podcasters, we always say that to you listeners, but so few listeners are brave enough to reach out to a stranger across the internet to say thank you. So be one of the ones that takes action, make a connection. You've seen how generous Chris is with his time and knowledge and thoughts and perspectives here today. So Chris, on behalf of myself and all the listeners, thank you so much for joining us here today on the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Thanks for having me.